Five, four, three, two, one. All right, good evening, or I should good tavach. I should tell you, I'm always doing this a little bit early, Wednesday night here. Welcome to the eighth lecture of our series entitled the Winter Series of 2020 to 2021. It's December, soon we'll be in 2021. The name of the series is Roller Coaster: The State of Israel and the Jewish People in the Mid-1980s. Today's the 8th lecture out of 16. The title of the lecture is The Looking Glass Wars, the Age of Pollard, Vanunu and Iran-Contra, or as much of it as I can get to in one night. I, as always, want to thank our sponsors, the Lehman family, for sponsoring the whole series, as they do every year. Thank you very much. I want to thank tonight's sponsor, as you see, chooses to remain anonymous, in honor of Rabbi Rottenberg, Shlita. I want to thank my tech team, especially my son Yehuda Leib over here, who's doing yeoman work every week to get this out to you efficiently, to Howard Elbaum for creating the PowerPoint along the same lines, and especially to Yossi Wetstein for being the Wizard of Oz and doing all the magic to get rid of all the glitches and make sure that you get a final good product. I am, as always, happy to say that we have the whole series sponsored. Some of you have asked they wanted to do so. The podcast is where we need sponsorships. If anybody's interested, let me know. You can email me. We're doing 3 podcasts a week that I think many of you know. And if you're interested in sponsoring anyway, let me know. And finally, if you're watching this on my YouTube channel and you haven't subscribed yet, please do so, because I understand that's what you're supposed to do. Now, with any further ado, let's get down to business. There's always a lot to cover. And again, we're talking about the Looking Glass Wars. Remember those novels? Age of Pollard, Vanunu and Iran-Contra. The decade of the 1980s was a decade in which terrorism was particularly prominent, particularly in the Middle East and particularly in the part of the Palestinians. I mean, it's always there. Terrorism has always been a constituent element of Palestinian nationalism, as you see in the first slide here, right? This goes back to 1919 or 1920, when they had the first riots in Jerusalem, just the beginning of the British Mandate. And so the way that the Palestinians, the Arabs at that time, were expressing their dislike of the Jews, were going and killing them, and hurting and raping and this and that and the other. This happened under British control in 1919, 1920, 1921. And then it died down for a little, and then revived in 1929. I bet you many of you heard of the Hebron massacre, for example, in 1929. And then in the mid-30s, 1935 to 39, came what they call the big uprising, or the Intifada. Once again, as you see in the next slide, one of the big ideas, at the lower right-hand side, you see the Baltimore Sun, or Baltimore News American. Does anybody remember the News American? Probably not all of you remember. We used to have a 2-newspaper town over here. And the headlines of the Hebron massacre of 1929. And above there you see a bunch of Arab fighters in the Intifada of 1935-39 with the slogan, "Kill the Jews." That's not the only slogan they had, but that certainly was a prominent one. Did the terrorism, the killing, the violence work? Yes and no. It didn't stop the Jews from building up the Yishuv. I repeat, it did not stop the Jews from building up the Yishuv. But it did influence the British to issue the white paper, which kept millions of Jews, or I don't know how many, out of Palestine in World War II. Many Jewish lives were lost as a result of the British fear of another uprising. So it was kind of successful, I'm sorry to say. In 1947, 1948, a big uprising of Palestinian terrorism. Remember, they shot the convoys on the road. Remember, they killed the nurses and the doctors outside of Jerusalem. There are many different massacres and stuff like that. In 47, 48. Did it work? No, not really. It was, as I pointed out last week, the Palestinian forces, the terrorists and non-terrorists, whatever you want to call it, buckled before the Jewish offensive. And it was the Arab armies of the regular states, meaning the Egyptian army, the Jordanian army, the Syrian army, the Iraqi army, and so forth, which saved the Palestinians, if you want to call it that. And it wasn't important terrorism, it was important in regular professional military operations. Now, in 1949 to 67, as we know, terrorism was a constant, it assumed the form of cross-border raids. Isn't that right? You didn't have in those years what we're used to now, the skyjackings, all this stuff. You used to come across the border and kill people. All the time. North, south, east, and west. This was the big problem. How do you plug up the Israeli border, which almost was impossible? Did it stop Israel? No. Did it cause a lot of trouble? Yes. After the 6-Day War, terrorism expanded to your hijackings. Remember that? They started a new dimension. No, it was take it simply, you can't cross the border, because after all now, how could you cross the Suez Canal to get into Israel from that side? That Sahel controlled everything. How are you going to cross in the West Bank and get into Israel? It's possible, but it's much more difficult when the Israeli army is there. And so the terrorist groups resorted to, what shall I say, big publicity stunts, blowing up buses, and especially the hijackings. Although, of course, over time, Israel developed countermeasures. I don't want to say give an eye in horror, but you haven't heard of too many hijackings, right? Because to put marshals on board. I still remember, and maybe you do, when the hijackings simply became a part of life and part of culture, as you see in this famous episode of Archie Bunker, if anybody's able to remember this. Let's go to this.
Now I want to talk about another thing that's on everybody's mind today, and that's your stick-ups and your skyjackings. Which, if that was up to me, I could end the skyjackings tomorrow.
You could?
All you got to do is arm all your passengers. You know what the passenger arm? And then he ain't got no more superiority there, and he ain't going to dare to pull out no rod. And then your airlines, then they wouldn't have to search the passengers on the ground no more. They just pass out the pistols at the beginning of the trip, and they pick them up again at the end. Case closed.
I want to tell you something. It's not a stupid idea. Israel does that. It's called the Sky Marshals. In other words, you're not supposed to know who the passengers are, but they have more than one of these people, and the terrorists know. Not every passenger obviously gets a weapon, but although I have a couple of people on my show that will be in favor of that, but do you have X number of people over there, and you know and I know this little old lady may pack a rod, and if a terrorist tries to do something, let's put it this way, El Al is not necessarily the best airline to go hijacking, you see? So this was simply a part of the new reality post-1967 of the hijackings. But as we've seen, there were a number of occasions when Palestinian terrorists landed on the beach, grabbed buses, killed lots of civilians, or grabbed schools and killed school children, remember those? Or simply chopped people up, I mean literally. Men, women, and children. Smashed their heads against rocks. Remember that guy who did it with the little girl? All in an attempt, because that's what terrorism is, to be so gruesome as to terrify the Jews and lead to their emotional and political collapse. Such is always the hope of the terrorist. In the case of Israel, it never worked. You understand what I'm saying? Terrorism is the tool of the weak, of the desperate. If they had a big army, they'd use this. This is say they don't have a big army, they use terrorism. But psychological. They can't fight the Israeli army. They ain't got that kind of strength. But you can go pinpricked and blow up here and kill somebody there. And then the idea is to terrorize and terrify the Israeli population, people afraid to go out of the house. Next thing you know, they flee the country. That's the terrorist mindset, okay? Now, to be perfectly honest, terrorism throughout history has only worked well in tandem with political engagement. In other words, when you have a political process going, and at the same time you're conducting terrorist operations, that empowers one side of political negotiation. That has worked very well. Right off the top of my head, you think about the Irish IRA back in the time of, what's his name? Tom Collins? Michael Collins, yeah. Not the booze. Michael Collins, where they negotiated with the British to get their freedom from England while they were blowing up and killing all the British soldiers. It worked. The Algerians did that while they negotiated with the French to continue the terrorist operations. That empowered the negotiators. Vietnamese did that with the French and with the Americans. That's basically what Kissinger was all about. He was negotiating with the North Vietnamese while they were blowing up and terrorizing the South, and it worked. And so, from a classic political science point of view, a guy like Arafat figures like this: let's do the terrorism. No, the terrorism itself doesn't do anything. Let's get engaged in a political process in which we're negotiating with Israel to bring Israel to its knees. And then let's use the terrorism that we're conducting all the time to empower our side, that Israel eventually have to give in to us. This is the only model that kind of works, and of course it wouldn't work, would it? because in the case of the PLO, certainly up to the late 1980s, the absolute refusal of Israel to even be gyrus the PLO. They don't count. They're a terrorist organization. They're not people you can negotiate with. They're a bunch of criminals, especially when the Likud was in power. This meant that terrorist violence simply reflected not part of a political engagement, but rather two things. The determination of Arafat and these guys to show that they're players. Can't make a peace treaty without us. We'll cause terrorism. We'll blow up, planes, people, cause terrible things to show, hey, we're still here. And number two, to express their native para adam, because Palestinians are just about violent. You understand? You see these terrorists. They rounded up hostages and they said, the heck with it, just kill them, or they just cut people up, and they smash babies. They just like to do it. So here, the terrorism is an expression of your native savagery. Okay. Now, when the PLO and other groups directed terrorism against Israel, they weren't dealing with a passive victim. No, it wasn't the old Jew, unable to respond. On the contrary, Israel by the 1980s had a ganze intelligence community, not just an intelligence service, with a great deal of experience, which is the only way you can learn things, as we see in this slide, about, in the dangerous rules of trial and error, what to do. So the Israeli intelligence community is a whole bunch of organizations. The U.S. has its intelligence community, and every country does. So, for example, as you can see at the top, the Israeli intelligence community is the Aman, which is military intelligence. Notice the Army has one, the Navy, anything nogea to ships and so forth is a job of the Navy intelligence. Anything nogea to airplanes and that sort of thing is a job of the Air Force intelligence, a separate branch. As you would imagine, they have the Mossad, which deals with overseas intelligence. Now they can overlap, but the Mossad is not the same thing as the Aman. And the Shabak, the Shin Bet as they call it over here, has to handle internal security within the country. You understand? And they have Lekam, as we'll see later on, which was the agency responsible for obtaining and securing secret technology. This is where you steal people's, what shall I say, science knowledge and technology and that sort of thing. Okay? And as you can sort of see from this slide, there are a bunch of little units within it. So the PLO wasn't fighting some helpless little guy over there. They're fighting a country with a ganze big Mimsad, as they call it, whole intelligence community. Now, the intelligence community, and by the way, the Israeli intelligence community is not only focused on the Palestinians. They got to worry about all the other countries in the Middle East that are trying to kill them. They got to worry about Russia and those kind of places, especially back in those days. They had a lot on their plate. But a big part of what Israel spends in intelligence money has had to be, since at least the early 60s, on handling what's this Palestinian stuff, okay? Now, the intelligence community was certainly kept busy by the constant threats and actions of the Palestinian groups. And over the years, I would say that the Israeli intelligence community developed what we call an action mentality. Now, it's habar lahargacha hashkim hargo, like the guy wrote recently in the book. Kill him. You understand? A guy's trying to plan something against you. I ain't got no time to go and follow him around the world and develop a whole file and all the rest of it. If it's possible, bump him off. That's a bloody business. Okay? And the answer is, it's a ruthless world out there. But there are people who are going to dedicate their lives to trying to kill you unless you get them first. There's somebody who could be some Palestinian, something other in Lebanon or in Egypt somewhere. He's going to spend, or she's going to spend every minute of their life, and I don't blame them, that's their position, that's their point of view, trying to hurt Israel. So if you have a chance that they're somewhere where you can knock them off, they do. This became the way of thinking with Israel versus these people. Just kill them. You'll tell me another one take the place, but meanwhile we got rid of this one. You see? Now, it's not a solution, it's a solution. That's the kind of world I'm trying to paint for you by the time you get to the 1980s. It's a particular decade characterized by this. So the result was a lot of back and forth action, Chad Gadya as I call it, okay, ping pong, between the two sides. The Palestinians always tried to pull off as spectacular and headline-grabbing actions as they could. The Israelis tried to kill as many of the perpetrators as they could, sometimes, as we see in the next slide, going extra-legally, okay? This is that incident that I alluded to a couple of speeches ago, which happened with bus number 300, which basically a bunch of Palestinian terrorists got on the bus and drove it down. The idea is to drive it into Egypt and with full of hostages, maybe kill a couple along the way, and then use them as hostages to get Palestinian prisoners out of jail. And those guys who killed somebody, whatever, get them as a prisoner swap. They're eventually blocked by Israel, commando raids and all that stuff. And so, now listen closely. And the Israelis raided it and killed some of the terrorists, and they took some prisoner. Now, here they are taking prisoner. A few minutes later, they bashed their skulls in with bricks. That's what happened. Now, nobody's supposed to know that. They didn't know somebody took a photo of them. So in other words, what I'm trying to say is like this. It's a cruel world. Israel has rules of engagement. Israel tries to say that it's a civilized country. I get it, and they are. They're a country of laws. Laws mean that when somebody surrenders, you don't kill them. And yet, and that's true, no question about it. And yet at the same time, on the actual front, you caught this guy, kill him, right? What about the heck with the law? Take him out, then you don't have to worry about it anymore. Otherwise, he'll be a prisoner in some jail, and somebody will launch another attempt to go get him out. It's the tug of war between doing the legal thing and doing the expedient thing. Now, in the case of Israel, this was a big scandal. Since Israel's a democracy with a free and inquisitive press, but at the same time, Israel lives in the dangerous Middle East. The Bus 300 incident that I'm pointing to over here created a huge scandal because they tried to cover it up and deny it. They lied to Shin Bet. They said, we didn't have the guys. It wasn't us that did it. We don't know what you're talking about. But the guy had photos on them. So eventually it resulted in three things after a lot of lying and cover-ups. So a little like Baltimore. Number one, it took down the head of the Shin Bet. Okay, Avram Shalom. He didn't want to go. But it was such a scandal. Mind you, this speaks well for Israel. What was the big thing they did? They killed these terrorists. I bet you a lot of people listening now say this. Because hey, so what? It's against the law. Well, the heck with the law. These guys are trying to kill us. It's against the law. It's against it. Well, it's Israel's law. If they caught our guys, they would bash their heads in. We're not like them. You hear what I'm saying? It's that kind of tug of war. And so, first of all, it resulted in the end at the head of the Shin Bet having to resign, and he didn't want to go. Number two, all the guys that did it, all what I call the Fauda types, were pardoned by the president of Israel. Right? And the reason he did it was they said like this. What they did was wrong. We need these guys. Israel cannot afford to fire them, get them ready. Because what happened? The next group of terrorists is coming down the road. And if we don't have our specialists who know how to fight these guys, we're going to get killed. So it's an interesting, we could have here for a legal seminar, or if you wish, a poli-sci seminar, or if you wish, an ethics seminar, or a philosophy seminar. And I'm serious, I'm not being funny. What do you do, right? What if this guy is like what do you call it? Aristotle's Ethics. What if I told you these two guys are the only guys that can protect you against future terrorist attacks, but they've committed murder. They bashed somebody's heads in. So one can say like this, Yikov Adin Sahar, let justice be done, though the heavens fall, and punish them and fire them and all the rest of it. And if a bunch of people get killed afterwards, it's too bad. Or someone can say, are you nuts? Are you crazy? And so the president of Israel, Chaim Herzog, just gave everybody a blanket pardon. But with the clear message, this better not happen again. And finally, I would point out this in the 1980s, the public lost faith in the honesty of the Shin Bet, seeing that they did false testimony and they planted evidence. It was just like one of these Baltimore police scandals. Okay? And until then, people used to say like this, oh, if the government says it, if the Shin Bet says it, they must be telling the truth, okay? And in fact, Israel, let's go to the next one, at that time appointed what they called the Judge Landau Commission. He later, Moshe Landau, was the head of the Supreme Court. This is like the Frank Church Commission. Are you old enough to remember, as I do, back in 1975, when Senator Church did the investigation of all the screw-ups and the misdeeds of the CIA? They did plenty of murders and things like that. And the Church Committee brought it out, and it was a whole big scandal, all the rest of it. But it was what we call a house cleaning. After that, the CIA underwent a reform. And now in Israel also, as a result of the Landau Commission, the Mossad, the Shin Bet, and the others underwent a reform to stick more to following the law. But in my opinion, I don't think that the security organs have never really regained the public trust. Certainly not what you call the Haaretz public, the Israeli liberal crowd. Because, no, are they telling the truth? They're not telling the truth. This is a hard subject. Okay? I'll tell you again, be interesting for an ethics seminar. It's a hard subject. Now let's turn away from the Shin Bet to the Mossad, which had a different job. You see, in addition to trying to kill perpetrators in Israel and in the Shtachim, that's the job of the Shin Bet, Israel sought, in the 1980s particularly, but not only in the 80s, to assassinate what I call the Mi'asim, who live in the Chutz La'aretz. and anything that's overseas is a job of the Mossad. So in other words, there's a whole long series of cases in which they said this terrorist guy's about to do this, or at least let's put it this way. Israel becomes convinced that this person's a terrorist, and it's not like you have a trial. This is the international world of spies and intrigue and terror, and bad things happen if you don't watch out for these guys. And so I just remembered there's a movie that was years ago Israel made. I saw a Mossad guy going and bumping off, as you'll see over here. Here, let's take a look at it. It's just the video. I don't think it's the audio. Yeah, there's the kid of the terrorist. Let's put it that way, and that's the guy walking with his wife in Turkey, and that's the Mossad guy. This stuff happens every day. That's my point I'm trying to say. Just made a movie about it. And he's walking there very nonchalantly, as you can see, and he's got a little syringe. He's got a needle over there with who knows what in it, and it makes excuse me, and meanwhile he stuck him, right? And he's making a clean getaway, and that guy, boom, down he goes. And the wife and children are going, what happened over here? And off you go, bye-bye. Now, they made a movie out of it, of course, but that's based on truth. This goes all the time. Certainly when you read the other day, they knocked off some guy in Iran or whatever. This goes on all the time. And, different times at different places. But I'm simply trying to share with you what I recall the Chad Gadya aspect of it. They kill one, he killed one. They kill two, they kill two. And on it goes. Because, especially in those years, and maybe other times, there are certain cases in which there is no political solution. For example, I'm just using today, we're in December 2020. What kind of political solution is possible between Israel, for example, and Iran? Iran says they want Israel wiped out. They say it. What kind of political solution is possible between Israel and, say, Hezbollah or Hamas? They say they say there is no political solution. You have to die. You have to leave. Israel has to be destroyed. So if you're doing like that, then you're dealing with a situation which is not a amenable political solution, unless the political solution means you agree to commit suicide. And anything short of that, so I'm going to try to kill you unless you kill me. And that's what you see over here. Now, all of this, I'm going back now to the 1980s, created what I call the world of Jean Le Carre. Remember him? He wrote all those novels. Here's the most famous of them in the next slide, The Little Drummer Girl. And what is this famous novel all about? The PLO blows up some Israeli thing, and then a Mossad sets up a whole elaborate scheme to bump off the head of the assassins, which I think they eventually do by the end of the book. And, as a movie and a book and so on and so forth, and England now made a series out of it. That's what they call Middle East Tuesday. That's Tuesday. But Israel's like this. If I don't do it, the guy's going to blow up another one. So what am I supposed to do? And so now, it is in the nature of the spy world to have little pearsum. Spies ideally want to be in a place nobody notices that they're there. Nevertheless, the 1980s became a decade in which Israeli spy stuff did get a lot of publicity, which Israel did not want, but they couldn't control it, including spy scandals. Now, as is often the case, it's a Chad Gadya situation. This one starts like this, the cow ate the milk ate this one did this, the dog ate the stick ate the dog, whatever it was. Okay? So, in this particular case, talking about the mid-80s, our story begins when Arafat and company were expelled from Beirut as a result of the war of 1982. Okay, let's go to the next slide. Here's Arafat being kicked out of Beirut. That was part of the Israeli invasion, Ariel Sharon, we talked about last year. Israel made a lot of mistakes. One of the things Israel insisted on and were able to do was to kick Arafat physically out of Beirut. And he was exiled, he got on a boat, and he went, as you see in the next slide, to Tunis. So look how far away Tunis is. It's very far away, all right? Here it is on the end of the line. I mean, it's not the end of the world, but it's not immediately near Israel, okay? So Arafat was exiled over there with the idea being, once he's exiled, he's out of the way. But Arafat was determined not to be irrelevant, okay? And so he plots terrorist attacks to show he's around. Or better yet, his chief of staff, Abu Jihad, Khalil Wazir, directs these. As you see in the next slide, he was the guy next to him on the left. Abu Jihad is what they called him. He directed the actual terrorist attacks on Israel from there. And he wanted terror attacks. I mean, blood and death in the streets of Tel Aviv, of Haifa. That's what we're talking about. That's what gets people's attention. For Abu Jihad, The dream attack is to go and attack Tel Aviv from the water, like the British did with Rommel. They tried to knock him out by attacking on rubber boats in the middle of the night. And so they got what they called Adavarius, that's the name of a ship. And they loaded it with all kind of terrorists and stuff like that, weapons. And the idea was to sneak nonchalantly onto the beach of Tel Aviv. The Kiryat, the heart of Israel's government, including the Ministry of Defense, is located not far away from the beach. Okay, that's a fact. And so they want to go right there and blow everything up and kill everybody. And hopefully they were going to shoot Rabin and Sharon. No, it was going to be a surprise attack. It was supposed to be the day before, the day after Yom Ha'atzmaut, something like that. And make a whole mess over there, killing hundreds of Israel's military elite and nerve center. God forbid, suppose they would have succeeded and broken into the Kiryat and killed all the military experts and generals and all that kind of stuff. It would be a major blow to Israel. It would be unbelievable, correct? And here, I'm going to tell you something. I got this from Al Jazeera. We have a video of him giving the speech to the guys before they leave. And he said, I want you to turn Tel Aviv into a nightmare. Look at this. I mean, the guy's a tchotchke over here, right? So, now, fortunately for Israel, they had some spy, I don't remember exactly how, who gave away the ship, and Israel seized the ship, and they interrogated and they beat up the captured terrorists, and they learned about the plan that was there, that they were going to kill everybody in the heart of Tel Aviv, in other words, decapitate Israel. Oh my goodness, the Israelis were shocked and angered, seeking an exquisite revenge. The Mossad set up something very clever, very sneaky, a major sting operation on Cyprus, where, let's put it this way. Let's go to the next slide. This is, I don't want to get you too confused, but let's put it this, everybody in the Arab world is out to kill the other person. That's how it works. Just take that as a clout. So in the 1980s, it was Syria versus the PLO. I mean, the Syrians were fighting others, and the PLO was also fighting Israel. But among others, the people who hated each other was Arafat and Assad. Okay? As far as I'm concerned, you can stick them both in the closet together. But they hate each other. So whoever's on Team A, Team B wants to kill. So Israel simply did like this. Every time Arafat sent guys back to Lebanon, remember Lebanon was occupied by Syrian army. The Mossad simply, they got a guy call Syrian intelligence and say, guess what? Abu Ben Babuba is about to land at 6 o'clock on the next airplane. And he's working for Arafat, which was true. Well, guess what? Abu Ben Babuba gets off the airplane in Beirut or gets off the boat somewhere and is immediately seized by Assad's police. And that's the end of him. He's dead. They killed hundreds. So Israel, in other words, bumped off hundreds of PLO fighters and officers without laying a finger on them, just by stool pigeoning them to Assad. You get what I'm saying? This is called the Looking Glass War. This is how they fight espionage in the Middle East. Well, that simply made Chad Gadya. Arafat got so angry at that, he sent a bunch of guys, and they killed a bunch of Israelis on a yacht in Larnaca in Cyprus, where the sting operation was happening. Well, Chad Gadya, Israel got angry and said, oh, you do that? We're going to bomb the PLO headquarters in faraway Tunis, right? That's a logistically difficult operation because it's beyond the range usually of most planes. It's not like Egypt or Syria or something like that. It's halfway across the Mediterranean. And I'm talking about in 1985, not the year 2020. So it was a logistically difficult operation. Israel needed precise intelligence on the PLO headquarters and all that stuff in Tunis. They asked the USA for this information. Give us all the info on the PLO compound. Caspar Weinberger, Secretary of Defense, said, no, I don't want you to go another bombing raid like you did on Iraq when you blew up Saddam Hussein's nuclear thing. Weinberg was still thinking like in the old ways, which is that the fact that Israel bombed Saddam Hussein was bad. You understand? Was bad. It was an Aveira. He wasn't thinking like America would think 10 years later, God bless Israel for blowing up the nuclear bomb of Saddam Hussein. And so he said, we're not going to give you any information. Well, Israel was so angry, Israel said that they did something stupid. Israel said, okay, if America won't give us the photos and the other information, we'll steal it from them. And they'll use their man on the inside, and that's Pollard. Okay? This is the famous or infamous incident with Jonathan Pollard, who was spying for Israel at the very heart of what was it, naval intelligence, something like this. He was able to use the highest level security clearance, among other things, to get the pictures and all that they need of the PLO headquarters in Tunis, figuring, why shouldn't America give it to him? They owe it to him. Jonathan Pollard is a terrible story on many levels. And of course, I'm aware, and you are, that he just got out a week ago or something like that from his final imprisonment, thankfully. For starters, I just want you to understand a few things about Pollard. If it was up to the CIA and the Mossad, the whole parsha wouldn't have started. In the beginning, Jonathan Pollard applied early in his career to join the CIA for a job, and they turned him down. Because of the shrink tests, And same thing when he applied to the Mossad. In other words, he wasn't working for the U.S. yet. He wanted to be a spy for the Mossad. They turned him down because of his psychological profile. The Mossad, anyway, had common sense. They said, we're not using an American Jew to spy on America for Israel, okay? That's going to hurt American Jewry. So that kind of sense they had. But Pollard was what you call a walk-in, a classic walk-in. He just showed up and said, I want to spy for you. He approached Aviam Sela, a famous Israeli pilot who happened to be studying at that time in New York. Sela had commanded the bombing raid on Saddam Hussein's nuclear reactor. So he was a top pilot. This is in the spring of '84. And Jonathan Pollard was already at that time employed by the U.S. government with the highest security clearance. And he said, America's keeping from you stuff that you should have, particularly since it's violating the intelligence sharing agreement that was put together with Ronald Reagan and Menachem Begin a couple years ago, in which they said they would share all the stuff with each side. Now, I want to tell you something. He's not wrong in the moral sense. The U.S. said they do it, but all countries say they do one thing and do another thing. Was it right for an American citizen, this is a good question I'm asking, to say, since my government is doing something wrong, I'm going to break the law and give it to another country? Now, you have to understand, there were issues that the U.S. did not share with Israel, which really made a difference. For example, after Israel bombed Saddam Hussein didn't announce it loud, but he went on a zillion dollar campaign to get A-bombs and who knows what, all kind of nuclear stuff off the books. Nobody's looking. He went to Argentina. It's a whole story around the world. And the Mossad didn't know about it, but the U.S. knew about it. And Jonathan Pollard said like this, he says, this is something that they have to tell Israel about. Okay, there's life and death. And so he told Israel about it. He gave them the information about the companies that were building up secretly stuff for Saddam Hussein. And so he says, when he meets this guy, Aviam Sela, the Israeli pilot, he says, I want to help you. Sela says, I don't know, I'll bring you somebody to talk to. He passes the offer, as you do in the spy business, to his superiors in the Air Force, what we call Israeli Air Force intelligence. The Air Force intelligence says, I don't know, talk to the Mossad. They're the ones in charge of overseas agents. The Mossad says, we know this guy, and the answer is no, don't have anything to do with him. He's unstable, he's not reliable, and anyway, it's fundamentally wrong to use an American Jew to spy in America. That'll support the idea Jews are more loyal to America, loyal to Israel than to America. Don't do that. But the Mossad was not the only spy agency overseas. Should have been. In a normal country, everything's centrally directed. But it's often not that way. And there was another separate Mossad running in Israel, an independent spy agency of its own. Let's go to the next one. Back in the late 50s, remember Ben Gurion in Paris secretly made the A-bomb in Dimona? When that happened, that was totally a Shimon Peres baby. He didn't want, for turf war reasons, he didn't want the Mossad to be in charge of security. He said, I'll handle security. And he set up his own Mossad. And that's to make sure nobody found out what's going on in Dimona, and also that Dimona can steal from around the world whatever atomic junk they need. If there's uranium in Africa, if there's some professor has some secret stuff over here, it's a dirty business. All spying is a dirty business. It involves lo tigno, lo tigzo, lo sana brecha, shakar, you name it. And this was called the Lishka, something or other, Lechem. Tafkidim Michadim, I think, something like that. And this was, therefore, the following. The Mossad handles regular stuff. We handle science and technology stuff. Was this a good idea? Not a good idea? The Mossad was very angry over this. They said everything should be centrally directed. I'm not going to take you through a whole labyrinth of very fascinating Israeli bureaucratic turf wars, which is actually a very interesting subject if you're a spy nerd. I am a little bit. And if you're interested in what we call the science of intelligence, right? The proper organization of intelligence and things like that. But leaving that aside, this organization, which was called Lechem, well, unlike the Mossad and the Aman, this one had no liaison with the CIA and with the U.S. intelligence community. This is a very important point. If you're the head of the Mossad, one of the most important assets of the Mossad is your contact with foreign intelligence services. Do you understand what I just said? Israel can't do all of its spying. Israel, and every country in the world does this. Every country in the world. You hook up with others. They say, listen, I have this and this information. You guys provide this information. I'll swap my stuff for yours. The U.S. does it every day in the year since 1945 with England. Since 1942 with England. Okay? If you have any friends that have anything to do with the intelligence business whatsoever, I'm not talking about super secret stuff. We have major information sharing stuff with the British. Always have. And with British type countries like Australia, New Zealand, and all the rest of it. Israel has had all kind of arrangements for sharing different kind of stuff with the British, the French, the Americans, the Germans, and all kind of others. I'll say it again. Everybody does. Nothing wrong with this. And so what that means, if you're the head of the Mossad or somebody like that, you go around the world and you talk to others in the same business, and you realize, and you have a sensitivity, don't tick off the CIA. You know what I'm saying? We need them, they need us. Don't tick off the U.S. Don't tick off the French, and so on and so forth. Calculate schar keneged, onish. And therefore, they would never take an American Jew who had a security clearance, high-level position in the U.S. government and tell him to go and spy for us. I mean, literally, steal documents, photograph them like in the movies, and bring them to Israel and that kind of business. You wouldn't do that. But if you're the Lechem, it's a small operation. They try to keep out of people's way. They just try to steal stuff, They don't have information liaison with CIA and that kind of stuff. CIA probably doesn't even know about them or doesn't appreciate what they are. And they operate in the old-fashioned, what they imagine James Bond kind of way. Which they make the rules up as they go along. And so the head at that time of the Lechem happened to be Israeli James Bond, for better or worse. He doesn't look like James Bond. This is Rabbi, died a couple years ago. So he's not the handsome one, the ugly one, right? And he is Israel James Bond. He's the guy who caught Eichmann. If I start going through all the things, he led a lot of raids. He killed a lot of people. He did all kind of amazing things for Israel over the years. Really remarkable things. Wasn't the right guy for this particular job. Now, he would disagree with me, but I'm just telling you what I think, right? This is my lecture. Now, the trouble is that Rafi Eitan was a real spy professional. And the world of espionage, it's not like you read in books. It's incredibly cynical, cruel, and ruthless. That's what spying is. You lie, you cheat, you steal, you leave your people behind, you betray. I mean, this is what it is. If you're not a trained agent, you're just a source, then you're just supposed to be squeezed for as much juice as possible, regardless of the risk personally to the source, because sources are expendable. You get what I just said? If the Lechem trains its own Israeli spy and sends somebody else, they're concerned about that guy because you want your people to be safe. But if you're using a foreign guy as a flunky or an agent, they come and go. They're donkeys. You understand? Israel learned this all the hard way. Go to the next one. Everybody knows, if you know the story of Ali Cohen, he went down because he was overused by the Mossad. You get it? He said, tell us more, tell us more. They learned this the hard way. He got caught and killed, as we all know. If they would have been smart, I mean, this is hindsight. They would have been smart. Once things started getting a little bit warm, either they should have pulled him out, or better yet, said like this, just live in Syria and don't make a move. Don't telegraph anything to us. Don't say anything to us. Don't do anything suspicious whatsoever. Just live normal. In a year or two, we'll pick up and we'll go weiter. By that time, he would have been Minister of Defense or something like that in Syria. You understand? If you know the story of Ali Cohen. But instead, he's always, telegraphing them, and that's how they caught him and things like that. So you learn your lessons through the hard way. Now, in this case, the Lakam, this organization, their decision to use Pollard turned out to be what I would call a hashkafa mistake. As you and I know well, the Pollard story has haunted us all for 35 years. And this is all for a number of reasons. First of all, using an American citizen. The USA is not like another country. Israel cannot afford to take off the USA. I mean, give me a break. Now, you see, if you're Rafi Eitan, he pulled it off before. In the 1960s, he had this arrangement where he stole uranium from some company in Pennsylvania, I think Nomatech or something like that. Who was here last year? Becky Pepkowitz and her husband. I think her father, she told me, was connected with that somehow or other. But in Israel, this guy, Rafi Eitan, this is under LBJ. And at that time, the FBI was snooping, but they didn't catch him. And he pulled off, and he stole how much uranium that Israel used for an A-bomb stuff. So he figured, you can be cavalier about America. No, you can't. Number two, using an American Jew with the highest security clearance was basically saying all American Jews are loyal or disloyal or potentially disloyal. So what you do to every guy, and I'm sure there are people listening to me right now who work for the U.S. government, probably in security-related areas, they have their clearance, all the rest of it, they suffered a lot because of Pollard. Right? Now you might say like this, what does one guy have to do with the other? If a Jewish guy spied for France, that's one thing. If a Jewish guy spies for Israel, then all the Jews are suspected of spying for Israel. Rafi Eitan didn't give a darn. I'll tell you again, he was that type of individual. He had his pluses and his minuses, but the minuses were the ones that predominate over here. But to tell you the honest truth, the whole leadership of Israel is guilty. Rafi didn't care, and Peres and Rabin and Shamir, as you see in the next slide, they were rather cavalier towards the American Jews. Man, how could they do this to get an American Jew in a sensitive situation spying for Israel and not worry about the effect it might have on the American Jewish community? And that really was a disgusting thing to do, in my opinion. But the answer is, he had such good stuff, the golden material. He was giving them such good stuff, they couldn't resist it. It was like offering somebody a candy to a diabetic. They couldn't resist it. You understand? He was bringing high-level information. Now, for the most part, it was information to get Israel, like the PLO headquarters and the stuff doing by Saddam Hussein, and American knowledge of Arab armies, Soviet stuff in the Middle East. So it's really no good to Israel. But I think, if I remember correctly, he also gave him the codes, the secret code manuals, the cryptography stuff, which compromised the whole American operation around the world. Now, they couldn't resist it. Now, in the past, as we see in the next slide, when Ben-Gurion was the prime minister and Isser Harel for many years was in charge of Mossad, they would have been more professional and statesmanlike. Like I said before, the Mossad would have had a rule: don't get an American Jew spy in America. That's all. Don't get it. It's not worth the risk, right? Rafi Eitan, head of the Lakam, I know he couldn't comprehend because he's a hard-boiled spy. I'll tell you again, hard-boiled spies have their use, but they also have places where it's not useful. He could not comprehend that a guy like Pollard would become an international cause célèbre around the Jewish world, and that Israel's ruthless handling of Pollard, I repeat, Israel's ruthless handling of Pollard in 1985 would turn Pollard into a martyr over time. A frum cause, by the way, because he became a frum guy in jail, and then, all the frum organizations got involved, and it would ruin, eventually, the reputation of Rafi Eitan himself, as well as the liquidation of his organization, Lakam. Because by the time it's over, that's what happened. He was ruined, his career in intelligence was over, and the whole organization, had to fold. I mean, the first thing Rafi Eitan did was, he went to Pollard, and this is what you do in the spy business. You corrupt the spy. How do you corrupt the spy? It's a rule of ruthless spycraft. You give him stuff. Many times you have. I'll just give you an example. I remember in Stalin's time, a lot of people spied in America for Stalin. A lot of people in America spy for Stalin for ideological reasons. They were idealistic communists. They didn't want any money. They were doing it l'shem shamayim, as they understood at that time. I'm not talking about what really is. I'm talking about the way they saw it. And this was especially true in the 1930s. And I remember Whittaker Chambers, who was like the American agent for Stalin at that time, later he turned against him. They had Harry Dexter White. I don't know why I remember. This is He was number 4 in the Treasury Department. And he was helping Russia, Lishma, L'Shem Shamayim. And the Russian agent came to this guy, Whitaker, and said like this, give him money. He doesn't want money. You got to give him money. Why? The guy doesn't want money. He's doing Lishma. Unless you give him money, he's not dependent on you. You don't have a hold on him. You can't blackmail him. It changes the entire relationship. It turns him a mercenary. It's necessary to corrupt him in order to make him a good spy for you. He doesn't want any money. At the end, they say like this, give him expensive rugs. They brought him expensive rugs, which he had. That's one of the reasons the FBI knew that he was a spy. You understand? That's how it goes. So Pollard came in not looking for that, but immediately said, I guess we'll give you money, we'll put it in a Swiss bank account. And now I know there are a lot of rumors out there that Pollard was looking for the money, all the rest of it, and we'll never know the real truth because you hear both sides put up their own lies. Isaiah Gate, this is called the Looking Glass Wars. Everybody makes stuff up. I'm just giving you the best as I understand it. You know, I don't know as much as some. I know more than many. It's full of lies out there. He wanted to do it to help Israel. Yeah, he was making a living. They immediately said, like this, we'll take you to Paris, take you to a fancy hotel, we'll give you special money, and all the rest of it, get you a better car. Now, this turned out to be stupid because it alerted the FBI. One thing, you have to be a genius. If you're in the internal security business, are you living different now all of a sudden than others? Me, myself, and I've been asked from time to time, and maybe you have, by federal government, do you know so-and-so we're considering for a job? He put your name down and he knows you, or you're a neighbor of his, or you're a friend of his. What can you tell about the guy? I said, what do you want to know? Has he been getting rich lately? No, anything unusual? No. It's a routine question, you understand? Because an average schnook working for the government, all of a sudden driving a Rolls Royce. What's Tutzach? You see? And Pollard started living the life of Riley. And anyway, it's disgusting. You understand? But it's spycraft. And so you have to corrupt the agent. Now, then, in addition, when the FBI starts watching Pollard, and he was an amateur, remember, he had no training as a spy. Plus, who knows how a regular person without special training deals with stress. I don't even know how a spy does, but at least has training for it. These guys have no training. So he immediately called the Israeli Lacom office in New York, Yossi Agur, and he said, the FBI is watching me. Agur said, okay, stay there, we'll be right there. Agur jumped on a plane and went away to Israel. All the Lacom guys jumped on a plane in Israel because they don't want to get caught. So he leaves Pollard behind, you understand, in a lurch with no instructions on how to behave. And this is how you take care of your own. And then he told him, go to the Israeli embassy, went to the Israeli embassy, and the Israeli embassy threw him out, and the FBI was waiting outside to arrest him. Now, as an amateur, Pollard did not get a good lawyer at that point, a lawyer who would have told him to keep your mouth shut under all circumstances, I think. Now, I'm not a lawyer, but my understanding of all this is don't talk, don't say a word, ever, okay? Don't say a word. Let your lawyer do all the talking. The FBI, I want to point this out, and the other agencies had no idea who Pollard was working for. If he would have been a pro, he wouldn't have said a word. In the next one, you see Kim Philby, the notorious British spy, who was at the highest levels of the British government and spy for Russia. And I couldn't find it. Years ago, I saw there's a speech somewhere online where in his he ran away to Moscow. He was a successful spy for Russia. He betrayed his country. And he gave a speech to the East German spies, and he said, just deny, don't ever admit anything. It takes a lot of willpower, just don't admit anything. And from a legal perspective, Pollard eventually confessed everything. He says, if you don't admit anything and you have your lawyers do all their work, either it'll get you out of it or it'll get you a very reduced type of thing. Since he was an amateur, he was easily led, by the interrogators for the federal government, because they're pros, to confess everything, in the belief that he would be let off easily. As we know now, there was even a plea bargain, but at the end, Casper Weinberg, Secretary of Defense, sent a letter to the judge over here. Let's go to the next one. Here's the judge on the left-hand side, Aubrey Robinson, and it was a 46-page secret letter. And Weinberg, Secretary of Defense of the United States, said, it's difficult for me, even in the so-called year of the spy, to conceive of a greater harm to the national security than that caused by the defendant's view of the breadth, the critical importance to the U.S., and the high sensitivity of the information he sold to Israel. I don't know if that's true. Probably a lie. But I don't know. It's not possible to tell. So you have to take his word for it. As a result of that, I think you know this, There was a plea bargain, and nevertheless the judge gave him life. The judge threw it out because of that letter. Pollard employed, you can look all this up, or you speak to people who are specialized in this case. There are people in Baltimore, elsewhere, that followed this case for years. Pollard employed, I would call the attorney from hell, who failed his client and didn't prevent Pollard from acting like an ass, including announcing publicly, when I get out of this, I want to move to Israel. Smart move. I'm speaking now strictly from a defendant perspective. You understand? You're right under the law for the best defense. He should have get Alan Dershowitz, someone like that, and just clam up. And don't do anything. And if Dershowitz says burp, you burp. If he says don't burp, you don't burp. And that's the end of it. And he'll see you through this as best as he possibly can. That is the constitutional right of every American. Okay? But since he was there, I'm sure he didn't do that. If in 1985 and 1986, it's funny to me, sadly funny, if he would have had any of the Alan Dershowitz caliber lawyers that he later in his career as a prisoner got, because over the course of the next 30 years, very prominent American Jews tried to go to bat for him. I think you know that, including Dershowitz, by the way. People who were lawyers, super lawyers. And God bless them. They did pro bono. If he would have had them at the beginning, 1985, and listened to what they said, because the rule is you got to listen to your lawyer, then he would have, I don't think he would ever get a life sentence or anything like that. Now, from our perspective, our long perspective, now I'm talking 30, 35 years ago, in my opinion, I think it's Baruch Hashem that of all the administrations in office, it was Ronald Reagan, second administration, because the pro-Israel was at its peak. Now, Reagan and Schultz were livid, of course, but they didn't do anything to Israel. Okay? Now, the next president, George Bush, used to be head of CIA, a real wasp. And if he would have been president, he would have gotten death penalty or something like that. As it was, he pushed very hard against Pollard. And I'm going to tell you something. I don't blame him. I understand. From American perspective, he's not Jewish, from American perspective, to have somebody given the highest clearance and all that, to then go and betray your country, I don't care if it's to Israel or anybody else, is a terrible thing. Okay? Now, Israel, as far as this is concerned, was pathetic. Shimon Peres denied the whole thing. Then, once he figured he couldn't deny anymore, he said, this Lechem is a rogue operation. We don't even know about it. Once that was a lie, George Schultz basically said, yes, listen, cut the bull or else. I'm going to pull the plug. You got to come clean, cut the bull, we'll pull the plug. So Peres ordered, okay, full cooperation, and Israel had to accept, Justice Department groups came to Israel. Israel had to show them all the stolen stuff. It was an unbelievably embarrassing business. And even then, they didn't come totally clean. They tried to say that Avi Amsela had nothing to do with this, that Rafi Eitan had nothing to do with this. The Americans were so angry about this. For the rest of their lives, these guys can never come to the U.S. because there was a standing order for their arrest anytime they step forth American soil. Okay? As far as I can tell, and I'm not a geek on the Pollard business, but as I say, the biggest part of the damage was he gave away the military code books, which is huge. Okay? And so America had to rewrite everything. There are probably people watching this, some friends of mine, who could give you the real inside scoop, but they're not allowed to because they work for the feds. The U.S. intelligence community was fuming anyway that whole year. Notice Pollard, let's see the next one, couldn't have happened at a worse time. If you're old enough to remember this, you'll remember this. The American media referred to 1985, which was the Pollard year, as the year of the spy, because we found so many spies among us. Law enforcement arrested many foreign spies operating American soil. The preceding year had more. The 8 major agents in 85 for espionage against the U.S. was John Anthony Walker, remember him, who just gave everything away to Russia, Stalin for money. Richard Kelly Smith, Sharon Syringe, Larry Wu-Tai Chin. He was he was the CIA China expert. He was the guy who translated for Nixon who went to Mao Zedong. He was working for Mao. Okay? Jonathan Pollard, Pelton, Jeffries, Edward Lee Howard. These are guys who seriously damaged national security. The United States gave everything away to Russia. You understand? Now, Pollard wasn't in that league. But Weinberger, but if you wish to, you can say he gave it to a foreign government, and who knows, maybe Israel gave it to Russia or to China. That's what you say at that time. And so it was, as I said, it couldn't happen at the worst time. By the way, worse was to come to American intelligence, right? What happened a few years later? These are the real guys who did major damage. Aldrich Ames, remember him? And the other guy, Robert Hansen. I mean, they really gave away the crown jewels. Pollard is a piker compared to them. Okay? Now, that's not a good answer. It's like somebody say, why you misbehaved? Well, Shlomi also misbehaved. That's not a good answer. But just as a matter of perspective, I'm trying to share this with you. American Jewry, especially the Jewish leadership, flinched. Here comes a wave of anti-Semitism, like the Dreyfus Affair. What happened when Dreyfus was accused falsely of spying for Germany? They publicly humiliated him. Crowds ran through the streets saying, death to the Jews. People were assaulted, shuls were burned, all kinds of terrible things. And Pollard is not accused of falsely spying for Israel. He did spy for Israel, you understand? In other words, Dreyfus was actually innocent. They accused him of spying, he was innocent. Pollard was accused, he was guilty. And is guilty of a Jew stealing secrets from America to give to the Jews, to Israel. That's unbelievable. Here comes anti-Semitism. But you want to know something? The anti-Semitic outburst never happened. Never happened. Baruch Hashem, the USA is not France. God bless America. The country did not react like that. I remember it. You remember it. It's interesting. You understand? There's a better country. And, in my opinion, I think a lot of it had to do with the fact that they gave him such a stiff sentence of life imprisonment, which is tough. So, on the one hand, it's very hard on Pollard. On the other hand, the American people, the guys, they said, okay, he got what he deserved. He said, he got worse than others. Yes, he did. He did a terrible thing. You understand what I'm saying? The severity of the verdict, while technically unfair, possibly, it's arguable, to Pollard, that's difficult to ascertain, but I think it had a lot to do with the public saying, okay, he got what is coming to him, okay? For Jews in the federal government, I just want you to understand, Pollard was a monster, okay? And still considered a monster. I know the Frum organizations and the others consider Pollard a hero and so forth, and I understand why, but it's also true that he really made it bad for all the Jews in the Defense Department and CIA and all these other places like that. Now, American Jewry in general was split on how to view Pollard, but over the course of time, since he was there for so long, and he had all these transformations in jail, he became a martyr, I would say, for a number of reasons. First of all, the unusually long sentence. Secondly, there were many judicial improprieties in the context of due process in his trial. Now, I don't know what they are. There are people in Baltimore who can explain to you better than I can, Professor Lass and others, specialize in this. And there really were a number of due process improprieties. So from technical perspective, you understand? But these guys always appealed to the Supreme Court. Nothing ever came of that. And most importantly, I would say the reason the U.S. government didn't smash Israel was because the Reagan administration did not want to damage Shimon Peres when he was Prime Minister of Israel, because Shimon Peres was actively pursuing the Jordanian option that I spoke about last week. That's how it all ties in. Okay? Ever since Peres became Prime Minister, secretly, because he knew Shamir wouldn't agree, he met with King Hussein a bunch of times, and he basically said, please take over the West Bank. And I'll even agree, and Saddam said, I can't do it unless the PLO is involved, and because they'll kill me. By the time it's over, Peres said, listen, all right, bring in the PLO, we'll call him another thing. I mean, he made unbelievable concessions. And he wanted a situation where, for 3 years, it'll be a joint administration of the West Bank by Israel and Jordan together, and then Israel pull out or something like that. I mean, he was giving away the store. And America was delighted with this. I'll tell you again, Peres was even willing to let Arafat get involved, which the Reagan administration was salivating over. I'll discuss this in the future. And so Peres, because he was in the process, sincerely, of pursuing a policy which so much fit into what America wanted, he was given what they call in Israel the esrog treatment. Okay? Esrog treatment means like this: we treat you with great delicacy, like you treat a good esrog. You don't manhandle it. And so, all during the second Reagan administration, the U.S. poured in military and civilian aid into Israel in spite of Pollard. It's quite remarkable. The historians in the future will say, "Wow, America spied in Israel. and in this way. I'm sorry, Israel's fighting America, and nevertheless America continued to give him zillions, because under Reagan they gave him military aid and also regular economic aid. So all I can say is the Lord works in mysterious ways. Had this happened under a Menachem Begin government, och und weh. Okay? What was the result? Israel got the intelligence, back to our story, on the PLO headquarters in Tunis, and the Israeli Air Force launched an audacious raid, which astonished the world in terms of logistics, because they refueled in the middle of the air, and the PLO couldn't believe that Israel could get that far. They're supposed to be out of range, and they bombed the headquarters, but it was a failure, because nobody was there that they wanted to kill. So all the Pollard stuff was for nothing. So Israel then said like this. Some time went by, the Intifada started, and they said, we're going to get that son of a gun, Abu Jahab, and the heck with it. If we can't do it the easy way with the Air Force raid, we'll do it the old-fashioned Mossad way. Plan this meticulously, as a hit squad, coming from the beach, the whole business, and let's put it this way. They undertook a very complicated and audacious raid, which basically involved a whole lot of agents going to Tunis before and during and after, and fingering where this guy Abu Jahab was staying for a few days in a house near the beach, and landing the commanders on the beach like in a movie, and eventually he got in and they bumped him off. I was looking online, who has a very interesting and very detailed description of this assassination business? The Al Jazeera. You understand? Of course, they put their spin on it. Israel murdered a martyr and all this stuff. You just saw a minute ago, I showed you, that guy was giving a speech, let's turn Tel Aviv into hell and destruction. That's what tzaddik he was. But to them, he's a tzaddik. And there's a long piece, I'm not going to share with the long piece, but a very interesting piece from the Al Jazeera in which they go into detail, looking back, on how Israel pulled off this assassination. Let's take a look at this.
For the first time, the exact details of the operation were out in the open. The Israeli hit squad had apparently traveled to Tunisia by sea.
ישראל לתוניס בסירות הגדולות. ככל שהתקרבו לתוניס, יצאו אנשי סיירת מטכ"ל לכיוון החוף, באמצעות סירות יותר קטנות שירדו מהסטילים, סירות הטילים הגדולות של חיל הים, התקרבו לחוף, בחוף חיכו להם אנשים מטעם המוסד, עזרו להם לרדת לחוף, עזרו להם להגיע אל הבית של אבו ג'יהאד, אני מניח שגם חיכו להם שם מכוניות, תנאים, כל הפעולה עצמה נמשכה כמה דקות, אנחנו מדברים ממש על משהו כמו 10 דקות. חשוב להבין שזו פעולה שהתבצעה בלבל הכי גבוה של צה"ל. מי שפיקד עליה בים היה ראש אגף המודיעין, קראו לו באותה שנה אהוד ברק, לימים ראש הממשלה ושר הביטחון. זו הייתה פעולה משולבת של סיירת מטכ"ל וקומנדו הימי. מפקד סיירת מטכ"ל באותם ימים היה משה ילון, שהיום הוא שר הביטחון, אפשר להגיד שהוא היה מפקד המבצע. בשלב הראשון של הפעולה התקרבו לוחם ואישה, שבעצם היה עוד לוחם בתחפושת של אישה לעבר השומר, בבית של אבו ג'יהאד, היה להם ביד מתנה. בשומר ומפה הם שאלו אותו איך הם מגיעים לכתובת מסוימת, בתוך המתנה היה רובה עם משתי קול, כיוונו את הרובה לראש של השומר והרגו אותו, זה היה עוד לפתיחת הפעולה.
Having arrived outside the house and killed the security guard, the squad's next priority was to establish that Abu Jihad was inside. The Israelis had put together an elaborate plan designed to confirm the Palestinians' presence without alerting him.
I'm not going to show you, I'm going to go 40 minutes on this. If you're interested, you can email me and I'll send you the URL. But you see, it's a meticulous planning. I like the pieces about the Shalach Manas with the silencer in it or something like that. Next time Purim comes around, tell them to leave it at the door. Now, and of course they broke into the house, middle of the night, and they shot him 75 times, 76 times. Okay? Just to make sure each guy got up and pumped bullets into his head or something like that. So they want to make sure they got it right. Now, as far as I'm concerned, the best part of the story is that, and by the way, they shot him in front of his wife and kids. The wife was there, and then the kids came in. And they pushed him away. So let's go to the next one. Next day, Ronald Reagan was told by Colin Powell, the National Security Advisor at that time, he says, unknown assassins shot the guy 76 times in front of his wife and children. Reagan said, what did they do to the wife and kids? He said, they left them alone. Then it must have been Israel. Because in the Middle East, you shoot everybody. You know what I'm saying? So that's an interesting twist on it. The bottom line is, Chad Gad Yov. This knocked out Abu Jahab. Shall I proceed with the story and what they try to do, take revenge for the death of Abu Jahab? That'll take us past 1988. So I'll leave that for another time. This is how it goes in the Middle East. Also, Shonra Behikal Galba, also Galba Behikal Shonra, and so on and so forth. Also, Malchamovas, and that's what it is. Now, the other big scandal that I just want to touch on and have a little time tonight about, which happened the same time, was what's called Vanunu Affair, which happened also under Shimon Peres. Here you have a strange story. And it's in my mind, very powerful and interesting story. And I'll start it tonight because the hour's late. Mordechai Vanunu, that's a very classic Moroccan Sephardic name. Big Sephardic family. He was born in a Frum family in Marrakesh, in Morocco, in 1952. And they made Aliyah with his family in 1963. And his father was treated like Sal Shabati, like in the movie. The Moroccans are mistreated. They put him in a hot place in the desert, and running water. All that stuff. How they did the mistreatment of the Sephardim. Now his parents were from. They wanted him to go what you and I call today a black hat yeshiva. He secretly broke with religious belief as a teen. That can happen. So by the time he was 9th or 10th grade, he didn't believe in God anymore. He didn't want to make a whole fight with his family, so he kept it to himself. So instead of going to yeshiva, he went to army service, where he did explosives and stuff like that. And then he knocked about. Took some engineering courses, but he never finished anything. And therefore, he's a young man in his early 20s with the worst of both worlds. He's not from, but on the other hand, he's socially awkward. He has no luck with girls, so he can't make it in the non-from world. Not surprisingly, since the system in Israel, notice, life wasn't working for him, he had a complex relationship to the system. People who end up opposing social systems, economic systems, because it doesn't work for them. Okay? He tried for a job with the Shin Bet. It was turned down because the psychology test he failed. But then, only in Israel. This is like a movie. See, he couldn't get a job with the army. He couldn't get a job with the Shin Bet. He couldn't get a job here. He got a job with Dimona in the most high security, sensitive operation in the whole Israel. They didn't cross-check in those days. So they didn't say, oh, did you ever apply somewhere else? And let's see what the Shin Bet says to you. Now, nowadays, it's a computer world, correct? So nowadays, this wouldn't happen. But I'm talking about at that time. And so he got a job in Dimona, which requires the highest security clearance in Israel. They obviously didn't know about his failed test. In my opinion, they think they hired him because they said, oh, you live nearby. Vanunu, oh, you're Moroccan, from family. His family was from. I think the brothers were Rabbanim. Classic Sephardic, pro-Israel, you know what I mean? Anti-Arab type profile. And therefore, that he's not an Arab lover, a leftist, none of that kind of stuff. And therefore, he got in. But he was. You see? Because he started taking classes at Ben Gurion University in Beersheba. Dimona and Beersheba are near each other. Being that he was socially awkward, so he was excluded from you can just see this guy, in the cafeteria. The cool Jewish students circles, especially the girls, what should I say, ice him out. So who do you befriend? The other outcasts. The Arab students in the university, get it? Who draw him into anti-Israel clubs, group societies, including the Israel Communist Party. Because you go to them, you understand what I'm saying. So, he's a Jewish guy, he'll help us. He even gives anti-Israel interviews in student newspapers while he's working in Dimona. over the course of time, he evolved into, and people didn't realize this, he evolved into a certain type of Sephardi Israeli intellectual who buys into what they call today the Mizrachist narrative, and namely the Sephardim are Jewish Arabs who have more in common with their fellow Arabs than they do with the Ashkenazi Jews, who are the real evil. Okay? Now, there are some professors and intellectual types in Israel that are like this. Hear what I just said? The enemy is Israel because it's Ashkenazi. These guys aren't really Jewish, or whatever you want to call it, and they're the enemy of all the Middle Easterners, including us Sephardi Jews together with the Arabs. Now, it just goes to tell you, identity is everything. That's what's interesting to me. Suppose I told you that, suppose you grew up, this has happened. Remember in Hungary, suppose you grew up as a Nazi. Your parents are Nazis, you grew up with Nazi background, all the rest of it, and then you find out there's a mix-up in the hospital and you're really Jewish, and your uncle is the Ger Rebbe, something like that. Do you remember this happened in Chanadi, whatever his name is, in Hungary? And it's like, tore all the string, the short circuit in the brain, tore out all the wires, and he went through a mental transformation. In our case, there are Sephardic Jews, some, not many, who came to adopt this identity, and they view themselves as a kind of Arabs. In that case, there's a lot that flows out of everything, because then you say the Ashkenazim are the real enemy, and the Ashkenazi state is the enemy, and it must be brought down. It must be brought down. Now, this is the opposite of Avad Yosef. I said a number of years ago that the Israelis, especially the Ashkenazim, should kiss the feet of Avad Yosef, because he took all the resentment of the Sephardim, which was justified, and channeled it into a Jewish direction. Sephardim want to get back their primacy within Judaism, within Yiddishkeit. He took it away from expressing its frustration in the form of becoming anti-Israel, which it could be. Which it could be. Now, let's get one thing straight. Israel is a free country, has free speech. But the guy works in Dimona, for crying out loud. Now, Dimona, at his time, in the late 70s, early 80s, the security was surprisingly lax. It's supposed to be that there's a tight compartmentalization, which means you only know your part. Okay? That's just basic security. You're in charge of the engineering part, you know that part. You're in charge of the toilets, you know about the toilets and nothing else. You're in charge of heavy water, I don't know what they got over there, and you should only know about that. That's a basic security, so nobody knows the whole picture, and nobody can give it away to foreign agents. He was able to bypass all that. He was able to find out what's going on all across the board in Dimona. It made him a dangerous guy. Because now you have a guy who is mentally divorced from Judaism, from Zionism, from patriotism, working in the most sensitive Jewish place on earth. And who knows the whole setup? There's no compartmentalization. With this hashkafa of his, he views Dimona, the secret Israeli nuclear weapons program, not as a necessary weapon for Israel's security in some hostile Middle East. Not even as a Samson option, as you can see in the slide, where, remember, Shimshon pulled down the pillars and killed the Egyptians with him. That's the idea. That's the book of Hirsch. You see over there, the Samson option. Ben Gurion said, listen, we don't want to use the A-bomb, but if they ever come and wipe us out, we'll take them down with us. It's a last resort. It's a desperate. We're not going to have another Holocaust. If another Hitler rises, we'll take him down with us. Okay? So, therefore, it's a weapon of last resort, not a weapon of first resort. He doesn't see it that way. Rather, he sees it as the work of a malevolent Ashkenazi clique, a kind of Dr. No. You know what I mean? That's what it is. Therefore, Dimona is the epicenter of evil. Given this worldview, he honestly believed this way, combined with his vast knowledge of the inside of what's going on in Dimona, you have an existentially explosive situation. Maybe I shouldn't use the word explosive. A bad situation has been created in the heart of Israel's most secret installation. By the early 1980s, all these ideas that I've just described had fully matured in the mind of Mordechai Vanunu. I mean, he was so estranged from Judaism, he was into Buddhism. He wanted to convert to Buddhism. like Samson, but in a weird way, he decided to bring down the entire nuclear facility through public exposure. You know, it's Thomas Nafshin Plishtim in a different way. And to Vanunu as Dr. No on the left, and he considers Ben Gurion and Peres, all these guys are kind of a Dr. No, an evil genius, created a terrible situation called the Israeli H-bomb. And so he wanted to bring down Dimona through public exposure, and if it brings down the state of Israel, Matova Manoim. And let's face it, a guy like this was indeed in a position to do a lot of harm to the state of Israel. So, now, what exactly happened? My friends, you'll have to stay tuned for next week. We're out of time. Good to